I've been restoring the Madison, an 11-room federal-style dollhouse, to its former glory. Today I'm replacing some missing pieces and using my secret weapon for repairing broken and missing chunks of wood. I'm replacing the missing wooden pediments over the curved window in the door on the front. I removed this window from the front that has an intact pediment. I'm removing the acrylic windows and setting them aside so I don't melt them with my heat gun. The window pediment is made of 2 wooden pieces glued to the top of the window arch. I'm using the heat gun to soften the glue so I can remove them without damaging the pieces. I'm keeping the window moving because the heat gun is 1000 degrees Fahrenheit and I don't want to burn or bubble the paint. Previously, I used a mold and clay to replace missing pieces, but these are so simple I'm replicating them with wood. To match it as closely as possible, I chose wood that's the same thickness as the trapezoid part of the pediment. I lined up one of the straight edges and held it with a clip while I traced it. The wood is fairly thin, but it didn't split or crack. I think it's because none of my cuts lined up with the grain of the wood. I drew a line on the back of each piece so I know how much overhang it should have when I attach it to the window or door. I used the paint line on the original as a guide. To replicate the cap that goes on top of the trapezoid, I found wood that's the correct thickness and cut it to the same depth. I traced the shape on the front and the back and connected the lines on the top. I'm using this tiny saw to cut it out, and I'm starting by making a shallow cut on the 3 lines I drew to keep the cut even. Before I cut the other side, I made sure the original line I traced is still the correct length. These caps are thicker than the trapezoid piece and centered on top of it. I used the white paint lines from the original to draw some lines as a guide to make sure I glue them in the correct position so they'll match all the other pediments on the other windows. I added the replacement pieces I made to each window. I made a replacement cap for this window and used a toothpick to clean up the excess glue. I'm reassembling the original pediment I took from the window and using it on the front door instead, since it's the nicest looking of the 3. The door frame has some damage at the top and the bottom. I'm repairing it using a 2-part moldable epoxy I learned about from contractors during a full-size remodel. I mixed equal parts of A and B until the color was uniform. The front door used to be attached to the frame with a pin. The hole and that chunk of wood is gone, so I'm replacing it with the Sculpwood. I'm starting by filling the gap of missing wood with the epoxy. I'm slightly overfilling it and cutting away some of the excess using my X-Acto knife. Sculpwood is moldable like clay, so I'm using a flat surface underneath and trying to flatten it out at the top to replicate the shape of the original piece of wood. I think it's pretty easy to work with because it isn't sticky and can be shaped easily. This product is formulated to replace missing pieces of wood that are structural, so it dries really hard. It can be drilled, sanded, and carved. Since it's so tough, I like to get it into the correct shape before it dries to avoid having to do any sanding later. I used a bit of the leftovers to fill the gaps and follow the original curves on the arch around the pediment as well. The original missing pediment above the door must have been bigger than the ones on the window, which is why there's this small gap at the bottom. The Sculpwood is dry and it's nice and strong. Before I can reattach the door, I need to reassemble it. I received a Ziploc bag when I bought the house, and the front door was in 11 pieces. Let me know any theories you have about how this may have happened. Before I reach for my glue, I need to make sure all of the pieces of the door are here, so I'm reassembling it like a puzzle. The front was painted pink and the inside was left unfinished, so that made it a bit easier. My plan was to reassemble as much of the door as possible and try to replace any pieces that are missing. But I lucked out because I wasn't missing any pieces and they all went back together fairly easily. I'm especially excited about the brass kick plate and the original doorknob, which is very detailed and has realistic proportions. I glued the door back together as tightly in a square as I could. If the door ends up wider than it was before it was whacked into a million pieces, it may not fit in the door frame and that would be a huge headache. The door is reassembled and needs a bit of cleaning up. While I spruce up the door, I'll tell you a little bit about the Dollhouse's history. The Dollhouse style is called the Madison, and it is a federal-style mansion. It was designed and made by Earth and Tree Miniatures in Amherst, New Hampshire. The style of this dollhouse is still available to be made today, but this particular dollhouse is 23 years old and was made with some customizations. I bought it on Craigslist for $100 from a junk removal guy who was instructed to bring it to the dump, but instead decided to rescue it. Once I finished sanding the door and scraping off the dry glue, I used some more Sculpwood to fill in the holes and cracks. The door has a pin at the top and bottom. I need to drill a hole in the Sculpwood so the door can swing again. To fit the door into the frame, I'm removing the bottom pin and sliding the top pin into its hole. I taped the door in place and I'm using a tiny drill to make my best guess at where the current hole is for the original pin. This isn't the precise way to do this, so I put a video in the description from Julie Warren who explains step by step how to do it properly. I'm adding the pin back in, but not pushing it in all the way. Now that I see that the door swings nicely, I'm removing the pin so I can paint the newly repaired door. I'm still not sure what color to paint the front door, so I'm starting by touching up all of the white on the door frame. There is something so satisfying about covering grungy old white paint with a fresh new coat. I used some spackle to fill some rough spots in the door, and I'm painting it dark gray. I wanted to choose a color I think would coordinate with the light yellow house and the pale pink shutters, which I'm keeping as is. I reinstalled the door in its frame and stuck it on the front of the house and thought it was way too dark, so I mixed up a much lighter gray color. This looks almost white on camera, but it is light gray and it does dry a bit darker. I applied a thin coat and sanded it, then applied another thin coat and sanded it, and finished it with a final coat. I meant to add a thin coat of satin sealer, but I was so eager to see the hardware on the freshly painted door, I started reinstalling the doorknob instead. The light gray paint looked a little strange peeking through the keyhole, so I added a bit of black Sharpie. I reinstalled the door in the frame to make sure I didn't install the brass kick plate too low on the door. I'm using just a tiny bit of Fabri-Tac to attach it because I want to be able to easily remove it if you guys have a better suggestion for a front door paint color. The front of the Madison is looking so much better with all of the replaced pediments and the trim I replaced on the roof windows in a previous video. Next, I'll be repairing the shingles.